He had been invisible for most of his life in the city. One more name on an app, one more ring on someone else's doorbell, one more bicycle cutting through wind and neon to hand off a meal and move on. He wore a delivery bag the color of old asphalt and a hood that hit his jaw most nights. When he smiled, people saw a man doing a job. When he stopped for directions, they thanked him for being fast. Nobody noticed the small, steady ledger he kept in his head. How many runs tonight? How much left for rent? How many days until the next shipment of ingredients for a dream that lived in the margins of his wallet? That's the shape of invisibility in a city like Chicago. Not a grand disappearance, but a steady drift. People pass you without learning the sound of your laugh, the rhythm of your hopes, or the names you carry in your wallet. They call you when they're hungry, then you're gone. You are essential for 30 seconds and forgotten for the next 30 days. He was 34. He could lift a scooter from a sidewalk rut, haul a pizza box up a third-floor landing, tell a toddler their eyes were beautiful in Spanish, and be on his way. He had come from Guatemala a dozen years before, carrying a single large hope, to one day open a small place where the food he cooked from his mother's recipes could feed a neighborhood that would remember the name across custard cups and coffee spoons. He had seen restaurants with red-painted doors and people queuing around corners. He had not yet seen his own name on a sign. Instead, he worked nights and saved in small increments, tips of $1, doubles on weekend orders, hiding cash in a shoebox in his studio. The bike he rode when the city let him was a bargain from an online marketplace, $80 for a frame with more promises than rust. He had fixed the brakes with a friend in exchange for a batch of tamales. Sometimes, after a string of late orders, the back of his throat ached with the taste of fumes and fatigue. He slept in a single-room apartment that smelled faintly of cumin and detergent, where a faded photograph of his mother watched him count coins. He called his mother and his 2 sisters in Guatemala when paydays allowed it. He sent what he could. He swallowed pride the rest of the time. He kept his dream alive with gestures, a notebook of recipes he copied from memory, a list of small loans for kitchen equipment he dreamed of buying, a name he rehearsed in private, Rosa's Place. He never told many people why the name mattered. It was for a woman he had only recently met, for a moment that felt like a promise more than a story. He thought of heat, of cilantro, of the way a good broth made a family speak softer. He thought of work that would not be invisible. Saturday nights came as a blur of car horns and neon, the city lit for business and for pleasure. Doors opened and closed on faces of other lives, bar carts rolling past umbrellas, couples arguing about late-night plans, a college kid with a stack of textbooks. For the delivery drivers, Saturday meant the city owed you something, and sometimes it paid in quick tips, and sometimes in long waits. He clocked his hours and orders and miles. He had been doing this long enough that his hands memorized the fold of every pizza box. His ears could pick a wrong address out of a caller's quiet. On that night, his shift was the usual patchwork of runs. He accepted an order through the app, a pizza to 2847 Ashland Avenue. The address was a stretch of town with old brick and new paint. He turned his bike down the block, carrying the box against the wind like a small white shield. On the way, he passed a bus shelter where someone had posted a flyer for a lost cat, and a man with a trumpet that sounded like grief. The city felt ordinary, a place stitched together by ordinary people moving through ordinary obligations. There was, however, a particular tilt to the street that night. A bus idled at the corner with headlights like watchful eyes. A few doors down, a screen door hung from one hinge, creaking in the breeze. The air held a chemical tang, something sharp and quick at the top of the nose, that made him squint. He turned instinctively toward it, and there, on the second floor of a narrow 3-story facade, smoke was crawling from behind a window like a slow, dark thought. At first, it was only a trick of light and shadow, thin gray finding its way through curtains. Then the smoke thickened and rolled, and an odor came that burned the back of his throat. A woman on the sidewalk pointed with a scream that was the hinge of the whole evening. "My babies, they're inside!" Her voice cracked into the air, tearing a path through the ordinary noises of the neighborhood. She was on the building's stoop, hands up to her face, repeating or perhaps only breathing the same words over and over. Carlos, that was his name, felt everything contract. The app pulsed in his pocket, oblivious, then died quiet. A few people paused on the sidewalk, their faces folding into the same stunned question. Someone had already dialed 911. He heard a dispatcher's voice slightly behind the panic. "We're on the way. Units are 6 minutes out." 6 minutes. It was an answer and a measure at once, a thin line between delay and arrival,
between calculation and the sudden burning clarity of what had to be done. There are decisions you rehearse in small, private ways. Do I take one more shift tonight? Do I cross a busy street with a heavy bag? But there are other decisions that press themselves against your ribs like a hand, sudden, uncompromising. Protocol was a thing people made when they had time to make it. This was not policy. This was a mother's voice splitting the air open. This was a number in his head. 3 children, 1 adult, minutes before help.
He stood for a beat that felt like a small measurement of his life. If he'd been someone else, a uniformed official, a person with a ladder, someone whose work carried the authority of a plan, he might have reached for training. But he was a delivery driver, an invisible thread in the city's fabric, and his muscles had been used to carrying weight across distances. The city had taught him that moving faster sometimes saved you money, sometimes savings, sometimes time. None of those lessons readied him for the velocity of the choice he was about to make. He could hear the dispatcher again, clipped and steady. ETA, 6 minutes. The word wait hung in the air like a rule from some book of civic patience. Around him, neighbors were beginning to gather with blankets and coats, forming a loose ring of bystanders, their questions sputtering into mutters. A man waved a mattress from a nearby porch. Someone else yanked a door open and shouted for buckets. There was the sudden, inevitable human instinct to find something to do, to be useful in the face of a threat. Carlos did not think in rules that night. He thought of the small faces he knew from cartoons and from market stands, the way little hands can curl around your thumb like an anchor. He thought of his mother's hands, of the way they had cupped dough, of the soft, determined way she had taught him that to make something for someone was to make them visible. He thought of his own ledger, of receipts and rent, and the shoebox of savings he'd hidden under a loose floorboard that afternoon. None of that mattered. A life was before him in a way that begged action. He moved. He left the pizza box on a stoop without thinking to grab it back, launching himself toward the service entrance. The smell of smoke climbed into him like a question. The stairwell inside the building had the particular darkness of an old place. Narrow steps worn hollow in the middle, banisters polished by many palms, a faint dampness that could be rain or something older. Heat threaded through the air like a second voice. He climbed 2 at a time, breath working hard against smoke, feet finding footholds on steps that had been climbed by lives that belonged to other stories. At the second landing, flames licked at a door, 2B, and the paint blistered. He ducked around the fire by hugging the walls, feeling the plaster give a little where people pressed their palms in prayer. There are things that sound small when you first hear them. A crib's mobile tinkling in an empty room, a cough that becomes a warning. Inside the building, the light was darker, the smoke more honest. He moved up and up, counting landings as if he could count out a danger. On the 3rd floor, the corridor was a narrow throat that sucked at his hoodie. He could hear muffled sounds, the rattle of a child's sob, a mother's voice, incoherent with fear but precise in its need. The door labeled 3A seethed with heat, but it was closed. Through the crack came a thin sound, like a tiny thing tearing at its own world. He knocked, not because anyone would answer, but because he needed to see what would happen when he tried. The door held. Behind it, through the thin seam, smoke was pouring from under. He tried the knob and found it stubborn. Behind the wood, small breaths met air like fragile animals. He could hear a child say a single word in Spanish, perhaps mama, but the sound was swallowed by the smoke and a far-off scream that still hung in the street below. Carlos's lungs burned. He had no protective mask, only the damp cloth he had once used to wipe his face after a long ride. He wrapped it around his mouth by habit, then forced himself to stillness long enough to take stock. There were voices, a wall of heat, and a time called 6 minutes that might yet be too long. He thought of an image he had seen in training videos on safety, vague boxes and numbers he had not paid close attention to, and found that what he actually had to work with were hands and the push of his own will. There was a woman behind the door. There were children. He could imagine them as people shaped like meals and lullabies. He could imagine their hair and their elbows and the small harnesses of life that held them to a place. The smell under the door told him how close the fire was to the sleeping parts of the apartment. The stairwell beneath him hummed with people shouting and the sound of a mattress being positioned on the sidewalk below. Someone down below shouted something about blankets. The world had become a chorus, and he was an instrument in it. If there was a moment when fear becomes a decision, it landed in him then.
a kind of quiet that cuts through sound. He thought briefly of his mother calling him, of the small prayers he had tucked into envelopes back home, of how a life could be measured by the number of evenings you showed up for the small things. He thought too about the way the city notices people after they give themselves to others. Visibility, he understood, is not only about being seen, it is about being recognized after the fact, about the work that causes strangers to lean in and say, "We remember you now." He tried the door again. This time the frame gave with a sound that made his teeth ache. Wood splintered and caught on something inside, and the latch snapped free. Heat and smoke rolled over him, an immediate, fierce tide that made his eyes weep and his world reduce itself to two things: air and the person breathing next to it. Inside the apartment was a room flattened by smoke. The light was wrong. The furniture looked like shapes caught mid-motion. A chair had been shoved against a window at some point, a sign of struggle or of trying something desperate. A figure moved near the far side of the room, a woman with eyes that had the stunned blankness of someone who had been pushed beyond what she thought she could bear.
Around her were small shapes, a child clinging to a chest, another curled like a shell, a toddler whose legs were too short to stand in the chaos. He did not name their injuries, did not measure their breaths for drama. He moved by instinct, bowing down to lift and carry and steady. There was a 4-year-old in his arms with a small weight that was heavier than any pizza box, a weight that filled his lungs with the kind of protected focus that makes you feel like you have only one motion left in you, and it must be the right one. A 6-year-old stood at the window, hands on the sill, trying to understand gravity and rescue at the same time. The toddler's fingers clutched someone's sleeve and whimpered. Time becomes a taut rope in places like that. He heard shouts below. He heard faintly the dispatcher counting the last of the 6 minutes. He felt the building's bones tremble with the heat. A window frame buckled on one side, where the fire had concentrated its hunger. The woman, Rosa, blinked as if the world had been turned off and back on, and recognized the shape of the man holding her child, with a look that folded into something like stunned gratitude and bewilderment. She mouthed something he couldn't hear over the roar, perhaps a name, perhaps a command, perhaps a prayer. There was no time to plan. He took the small person and lifted, moving toward the window. Below, people had already placed mattresses and flattened pillows, hands held like a human net. Neighbors looked up with faces raw with the sharpness of waiting to receive a life. Someone cupped a flashlight in a way that made a small rectangle of light in the night, pointing for him to aim the child into the safety below. His arms were heavy and precise at once. He could feel cotton and the smell of milk, and the peculiar hot weight of a child who had been breathing smoke. He looked down once and saw a cluster of faces, leaning forward as if the very act of leaning could pull a life into safety. He thought of how often lives are saved by more than one person, by hands below and hands above, by a mattress and an arm, by a person who decides to be seen, and by people who look up. For all his hours of being unnoticed, the crowd below was ready now to be part of the story. That ability of a neighborhood to respond, to throw itself forward with blankets and chairs, was a kind of communal courage that often goes unnoticed until the very moment it is made necessary. Inside, the smoke grew. His own lungs protested, heat clawing at the back of his throat. He felt his vision shrink to a tunnel and then expand into the small bright bubble of a child's hair against his color. He moved with a kind of clarity that is not thinking at all, but acting through a body that knows what it must do. He lifted the child to the sill, then reached for the next small thing that made the room feel like a nest dangerously close to unraveling.
But the building had a sound now, a keening, as if the bones of the place were wailing. A floorboard beneath his foot made a sound he could not name, a sharp note of complaint. In the street, a siren threaded its way through traffic, an answering chord to the human chorus that had gathered. He could feel the urgency like a pulse under his skin. The 6 minutes the dispatcher had promised felt like an age. The blackness at the edges of the window swelled with smoke, and in that swelling, something changed. He looked once more at the faces below, then down at the child in his arms. Rosa's mouth opened and closed as if she were tasting the idea of survival. Something inside him tightened to the measure of the moment. That line between being unnoticed and being known is measured in the weight of what one person will take onto themselves in a single breath. He turned back into the room to reach for the third small body, a movement that carried all the gravity of a decision already made. The corridor beyond the room seemed to breathe with heat. Behind him, The city carried on creating orders in music and small modern cares. Inside that apartment, the world had narrowed to the span of a man's arms and the answers of neighbors below. For a second, he was thinking in the most practical way he had ever thought. Lift, brace, tass, lower, repeat. For a second, the training of being quick and precise in deliveries, the posture of moving a box without wasting time, of adjusting so you don't tip the contents, felt like it had been made for this very second. His hands, used to balancing food and warmth and expectation, became tools that had another use now, to ferry life across a thin, dangerous aperture. He did not imagine commendations. He did not imagine cameras or medals. He imagined only the way a child's small hand rested on his wrist like a promise, and the way the city, in some small way, could be stitched back together by one act of visible courage. He could hear someone below shout encouragement, and the sound was like an extra pair of arms. But the apartment refused to be gentle. The heat pressed with a bluntness that suggested the building had its own mind. A beam creaked as if in protest. He reached for the last small figure and felt the floor under his foot shiver. The sound was like a soft cracking that moved through him in a way that told him, "Be quick." He gathered the child, and with the kind of motion that collapses time, turned toward the window that had become, in the span of minutes, a threshold between two kinds of world. That was where the decision hardened into action, to pass the child into the night and the arms below, to bring the mother with them if he could, and to be willing to take on the cost of his own safety in the bargain. He had no ladder, no harness, no training, only a bag full of napkins and a lifetime of knowing how to carry something without dropping it. The building groaned.
The city sirens drew closer, their sound like a promise half kept. The smell of smoke was thick enough to taste. He reached the sill and met a small hand with his. A neighbor below raised a mattress like a shield. Someone's voice cracked out a single instruction that was not a technique, but a prayer. For all the sameness of his nights as a delivery driver, he felt, with startling clarity, how different this one would be when people looked back at it. He was no longer merely the man with the pizza bag on his shoulder. He was a figure in someone else's life, a name that could be spoken later in gratitude. And in that instant, just before anything else happened, the building made its opinion known. A board under his foot shrieked and bent. Dust and a hardness like a living thing fell through the air. He heard, high and small, the sound of something giving way. He had already committed with his shoulders and his breath. The city outside could not have known the exact geometry of the moment. Inside, time snapped to a single point. He had to choose the next small motion and trust that the people below would keep their part of what the city's kindness offered. He pushed forward into the noise and the heat. He took another step. The world narrowed. He braced, then moved. The children's small bodies were in his arms, and the mother's hand brushed his sleeve. Below, the mattress waited like a promise fashioned from other people's tenderness. Around him, neighbors lifted their eyes, and in their faces was the sharp and immediate hope that reads like morning in a place that had felt forever night. He stepped to the edge and leaned, the city folding and fracturing all at once. The next instant held the weight of everything he had ever been, and everything he might be made into by this choice. The air vibrated, the floor beneath him sighed. And then, the world held its breath with him. Tell me which city you're watching from. The mattress below rose and fell like a small collective breath, a patchwork of hands and shout and faith. Carlos passed the first child into that net of arms. The little body slid into waiting palms, then into blankets, into neighbors' murmured comforts. Someone cried out, and the sound braided with the hiss of heat. He felt the small hand slip from his fingers, and then, safe weight gone, an absence that made room for new breath. He reached for the second child. The 6-year-old at the sill moved with a kind of awful bravery, as if the window had suddenly become a teacher, and she an eager student. Carlos steadied the children's shoulders with 2 hands, no technique, only muscle memory and will, and then let go. Down below, strangers folded themselves around a fragile life and lifted. He heard the hollow, relieved sound of air filling lungs that had been held too long. The toddler was wrapped in a cloth the color of old oranges and milk.
The smallest body was nothing like the weight of a pizza box. It demanded a tenderness that flattened something inside his chest.
When he held that child at the window, the toddler's fingers draped around his thumb like a rope. Carlos handed the little one over with the slow motion of someone taking care not to break the world. Rosa came next, moving with a kind of stunned momentum, her eyes like polished stones, her voice a broken thing at the edge of understanding. She found him through the smoke and reached for the hand that had already been carrying strangers' lives. For a second, there was recognition that needed no words. He breathed and felt the heat on his face like an unforgiving sun. By the time he turned back for himself, the building had decided to give up some of its bones. A blacked board shrieked under his boot, a sound like an animal in pain. The ceiling above him protested in a low, personal way. He could see the street below through a haze of gray that had once been night. The mattress held people as if it were stitched to the moon. Hands were upturned and waiting. He jumped. The fall was less cinematic than the thought of it. Weight followed by impact. The sudden surrender of being carried by your own body instead of a crowd's lifted arms. He hit hard. Air left him in a single meaned breath. Pain flamed through his ankle, up his shin, a starburst of white. A rib under his left lung complained as if someone had struck it with a dull hammer. His mouth filled with the taste of smoke and grit and something metallic, the way broken things sometimes taste. Hands were on him at once. Neighbors hauling, someone shouting a name to cut through shock. A man pulled at his jacket, someone else pressed something cool to his forehead. Above the gutter of coughing and the bright, immediate care, he heard a different sound, a floorboard snapping, then another. The third floor gave with a surrender that made the air itself go hollow. Plumes of soot and splintered wood fell where he had just stood. Carlos felt that surreal, astonishing luck that arrives when danger and timing collide with a human body that refuses to be simple. He lay there for a breath, aware of a pain that painted his ribs in narrow, sharp strokes. He could not move easily. His ankle throbbed like a protest. He tasted iron. Still, the sight of Rosa's face, a face no longer in the room but across the street, alive, bit through the fog of shock and became the anchor. Paramedics arrived with the blunt, exact motion of people trained to move quickly and safely. Their hands were steady and calm in a way that made the world feel like it had found its plan again. They wrapped him gently, asked questions in short bursts, voices soft and sharp. Someone shone a light into his pupils and spoke his name until he could answer. Sirens layered over sirens, the city's long, urgent exhale. Rosa clutched her children and walked toward where he lay on the sidewalk.
Her knees were unsteady. Someone steadied her. When she reached Carlos, she did not speak immediately. She simply placed a hand on his forehead like a benediction. The crowd around them shifted into a ring of held space. There was a sound like crying, some of it relieved, some of it raw, and then, as is always the pattern in emergencies, the practical took over. The injured were loaded into ambulances, the fire department set to their business, neighbors checked one another. At the hospital, the antiseptic smell and the neon fluorescence condensed things into clinical, honest words. Broken ankle, cracked ribs, smoke inhalation. They were the kinds of descriptions that said he would have a long, real recovery, not a miraculous recovery. He would be mended by hands and rest and time. He would have scars and memory. The doctors told him, gently, that his bones would knit and that breathing would get easier as the smoke cleared out of his lungs. He accepted their assessments without theater. He had, after all, never wanted applause. He had wanted the small, sustaining promise that people stayed alive. Someone had recorded everything. Phones had come out of pockets below the window when the mattress shivered and the children landed. Shaky footage caught a man handing over lifetimes and then flinging himself into the night. The clips moved fast, first through neighbors' shared chats, then onto social platforms, then onto feeds where millions of strangers could watch a life be saved in the space of a 30-second video. The footage was intimate because it was real. Smoke, a window breaking into darkness, a man in a pizza-stained jacket, a mother's face folding in on itself as her children were carried away to safety. The viral arc is quick and strange. People who never see one another press the share button. The city's feeds filled with the same pixelated, urgent images. Comments stacked up, gratitude, disbelief, fury when the story turned to how an app had briefly suspended the man's account in the hours after the rescue. The initial suspension, An automated response to an unpaid balance or a policy trigger felt callous in the face of what had happened. Social media did what it does best and worst. It multiplied outrage until companies could not ignore it. There were threads demanding answers, others offering prayers, and some people using the attention to ask for structural changes that would make the invisible less invisible. The delivery platforms were forced into a narrative they had not written. Within a short time they reversed course, publicly and loudly. A bonus was offered, an amount circulated in the press that read like an attempt to make amends, and a promise to review policies followed. DoorDash, Uber Eats, Grubhub, names that had been part of the background noise of his work, sent statements and outreach.
A GoFundMe started by someone in the neighborhood surged as thousands moved money across virtual counters. 2 $20 gifts, $150 gifts, then $500 and $1,000. Donations multiplied until the page number climbed into the hundreds of thousands. The money was not the point, people said, but it mattered. It meant a chance to fix what danger had broken. Medical bills, lost work, the small enterprise of a restaurant dream. City leaders noticed. A mayoral representative presented a local civic honor that carried weight for being public, an official recognition that turned an anonymous man into a named citizen of consequence. Fire Chief Patrick O'Brien wrote a letter, and then, in a ceremony with uniforms and applause, placed a Medal of Valor around Carlos's neck. The medal was a cold metal pressed against cracked ribs and a healing ankle, a symbol that the city had decided to speak his name out loud. The mayor used the moment to praise neighbors who had made the mattress ladder, to call for better systems, and to commend the crowdsourced courage that had been present that night. All of it felt strange to Carlos. He, who had lived so long at the edges of notice, found himself the center of attention. Cameras tracked him walking into public spaces, reporters asked for statements, a parade of offers arrived, paid appearances, corporate roles, invitations to be a spokesperson for the face of essential workers. He listened politely and refused. What he wanted was simple and stubbornly private, to open a small restaurant where a woman named Rosa would be remembered every time a sop of bread or a bowl of broth left his kitchen. He wanted a work that was steady and honest, akin to the slow building of a life in Guatemala, where his mother and sisters waited for the postcards he could rarely afford. The GoFundMe and the push from community donors made the dream possible sooner than he had expected. There was a practical side, medical bills to cover, a months-long gap where he could not work, physical therapy to attend. But when the numbers were balanced and the immediate needs tended to, he chose to put funds, some of them, into something that would make the invisible visible in an everyday way. Rosa's place opened not as a monument, but as a modest, luminous room with steam on the windows and a chalkboard menu written in hurried, loving script. He named it for the woman whose babies had been saved that night, a name meant to keep the story alive in the way a meal can keep memory warm. On opening day, the line curled around the block. People brought flowers and balloons, neighbors and firefighters, reporters who had been there from the start, and those who arrived to see a life remade. Rosa herself stood behind the counter for a moment, holding a cup like an offering. She tasted a spoonful of a soup that had been made from a recipe Carlos had kept in his head, one that had come from a notebook of his mother's recipes.
The flavor was as much a language as any speech. Herb and heat, salt, and a tenderness that made strangers sit straighter at tables and speak softer to one another. He used the restaurant as a place for reciprocity. Once a month, he set aside an evening board and a long table for delivery drivers, people who kept the city fed, but often lacked seats in the rooms where gratitude was spoken aloud. The free dinners became something the neighborhood expected, a night when drivers could eat without thinking about fares or tips, a night when those who had been overlooked were asked to sit first. He hired a few fellow drivers part-time, offering them schedules that considered their lives outside of the app. The gesture was small and practical, and carried with it a dignity that many of his former shifts had not offered. The city continued to fold his story into its other stories. There was a plaque in a small, newly planted area, Courage Park, someone called it, though the name came from a petition that read like a neighborhood prayer. He did not aim for immortality. He wanted a place where children could climb and where people could sit and be remembered for acts that made a community remember itself. The plaque mentioned names: Rosa, the children, the neighbors who had formed the mattress net, the firefighter who had arrived, and those in uniforms who had risked themselves. It mentioned a single delivery driver who had been invisible until he was not. That visibility was complicated. It brought phone calls from his mother that were long and full of small things, the way his voice trembled as she asked if he would return the money she had once lent him, the way she insisted he eat, the way they laughed through the static about a dream that had stubbornly refused to remain just a dream. He sent money home more often now, but he also took back a promise he had made to himself in quiet rooms, that Rosa's place would be a place where others could find warmth, just as he once had found it in the memory of his mother's kitchen.
The injuries healed into the kind of scars that require patience. Physical therapy was a daily ritual, exercises that taught his ankle to remember how to be steady again, breathwork to clear the last edges of smoke from his lungs, and the ache in his ribs that dulled with chyme. He moved slower for a while, not because his body demanded it, but because attention had taught him to notice small things that used to go by in a hurry. He found the city softer in some ways. People who had once been passing faces now stopped to ask about his recovery or to drop off a loaf of bread. The admiration he received was not the currency he cared about, but he accepted it with a humility that was not false. He had saved lives, yes, but life had given him a chance to steward a different kind of meaning out of that night. The viral footage, the GoFundMe, the mayor's speech, all of it provided a platform.
He used the platform to insist, softly, that the real story was not about a single man, but about the web of people who made rescue possible. He thanked the crowd that had stood under the window, the firefighters who had arrived, the paramedics who had worked in the antiseptic light, the neighbors who had banded together. He spoke of dignity and work, of the many who live on the margins and carry the city forward in ways that go unseen. He refused to be turned into a brand, and yet he saw an opportunity. People were listening. Companies offered to make him the face of campaigns, to trade his likeness for a brief, tidy narrative about heroism. He declined. He did not want his stories sold back to the world as a package. Instead, he took donations and gifts and turned them into community programs. A fund for drivers who found themselves in crisis, a scholarship for culinary students from immigrant backgrounds, a small grant for neighbors to make their stoops safer. Rose's Place became a hub for these efforts, with a shelf of pamphlets on worker rights, an envelope on the counter for crisis aid, and a regular wall where local kids could post drawings. The restaurant was a tiny institution of care. The family he had helped stayed close in a way that was both private and public. Rose's children, Maria, Diego, and little Louise, grew under the watchful, grateful eyes of an entire neighborhood. Maria, the oldest, took to the counter at Rose's Place on weekends, sweeping and answering greetings with the shy steadiness of someone who had watched life tremble and then steady. Diego, the middle child, drew pictures that ended up on the windows. Louise, the toddler that night, grew into a child who liked to sit on a stool and pretend to make soup with a wooden spoon. For Carlos, those small everyday tableaux were their own kind of reward, to see children laugh where smoke had once been the center of the world. Years later there was a wedding. It was modest and full of neighbors, a gathering at Rose's Place and in the small patch of Courage Park where string lights had been hung between trees. The crowd was a map of memory, neighbors who had been on mattresses, firefighters in plain clothes, delivery drivers who had become friends, the mayor in a suit who clapped like everyone else when vows were exchanged. He married with a feeling of community around him, not as someone who had achieved fame, but as someone who had been held up by many hands. The plaque in Courage Park weathered into a familiar thing. Children ran near it. Parents read its words as if they were an instruction in how to live. Notice the people who carry your meals, the ones who show up unseen. The park hosted monthly gatherings where drivers, neighbors, and friends brought food to share. Rose's Place sent out trays. Sometimes the mayor came by. Sometimes he did not. Mostly it was ordinary people showing up for one another. There was critique woven through the applause, too. The initial suspension of the delivery app account remained a thorn. People used his story to ask bigger questions about how platforms treat the people who keep them running, about safety nets and fair policies, about the dignity of labor that too often hides behind an interface. Carlos did not posture as an activist, but his experience became a concrete case in public conversations about labor and technology. City councils debated small changes. A handful of organizations pushed for better protections. The conversation did not end in justice overnight, but it gave language to people who had felt voiceless. Through all of that, Carlos stayed rooted in practice. He taught a few cooking classes in the restaurant's back room, simple sessions where he showed how to make broths and to fold masa without pretension. He hired friends and old shift partners. He opened Rose's Place as a place of second chances and regular hours and dignified pay. When someone asked him why he had saved those children, he would say in a tone that was neither sermon nor boast, that he had simply acted like a person. It was the only thing to do, he would say, and the words landed like a small, stubborn truth. When the medal was mentioned in interviews, he would put a hand over it and look anywhere but at himself. He preferred to speak about names and faces rather than accolades. He loved to tell the story differently, about the mattress people,
The neighbor who cupped a flashlight, the shaking hands that caught a child. He wanted credit to be spread out like a blanket over everyone who had made the night end with people walking away. There were quieter moments, nights when the restaurant closed and he walked home to a studio that smelled of spices and of the city at rest. He would sit and call his mother in Guatemala and tell her about the day's soup or how a child had learned to ask for seconds in English. She would respond with advice softened by miles. Make sure to eat. Remember to rest. Keep your heart humble. Those small conversations stitched him back to the other life he carried in his pocket, the family that had sent him into the world and taught him hands-first kindness. The invisible became visible in odd ways. People recognized him on the street, and seeing his stroll offered the small deference of a way. Children, taught by their schools to look for acts of courage, would run up and put a crayon drawing on the restaurant shelf. At first, he flinched away from that attention. Then he learned to accept its odd warmth as a promise that the city could change how it noticed people. The cameras eventually moved on to the next story, but the street where the mattress had been stayed intact as a locus of memory. People would point it out to visitors like a minor shrine to ordinary devotion. Once, sometime after the crash and when his ankle no longer throbbed, he walked the block where the building had stood. The facade had been repaired. New paint, fresh mortar.
Children played in front of a stoop that had been patched. A neighbor stopped him and said simply, "We remember." It was a sentence that felt like a benediction, 3 small words that held a lifetime. He knew then that the action had altered not only those he had helped, but also the network of people who had once viewed one another as passing figures. In public speeches, he would sometimes say that heroism is a choice, not a title. Then he would tell the story of the mattress, of the neighbors who had caught the falling, of the ways ordinary attention can become rescue. He refused to romanticize risk. He would not instruct others to emulate dangerous choices. The night had been its own calculus, and nobody should mistake courage for a recipe. But he insisted that people notice those who make their days tolerable and possible. The drivers, the janitors, the cooks, the teachers, people who are essential in quiet measures. The story of the invisible hero reframed itself into something communal. He did not become a myth so much as a mirror, an image that asked the city to see itself doing the right thing. Rose's place remained small and full of steam, a place where plates were passed and names were called so people would be recognized. Once a month, the corner table was reserved for drivers. The sign on the door read in Carlos's tidy handwriting, "Tonight we eat together." Years nodded gently and unwound. Maria grew into a polite, steady young woman who could run the register without glancing at prices. Diego learned to paint and hung one of his early canvases on Rose's place wall. Louise, who had been a toddler with smoke in her nostrils, developed an appetite for beans and stories of the man who had arms that smelled of broth. Carlos watched these ordinary scenes, the folding of napkins, the clatter of dishes, the scrape of chairs, and felt something that had nothing to do with medals or mentions, a daily peace that had been earned by being visible in the ways that matter. When the city put a little ceremony in Courage Park to mark the anniversary of the rescue, children ran circles around the plaque. Fire Chief Patrick O'Brien stood with a few of the original neighbors, his uniform a familiar shape against the soft winter light. The mayor spoke briefly about civic responsibility. Others talked about policy. Carlos stood aside and clapped, not because he sought applause, but because applause is sometimes a painfully accurate measure of communal gratitude. People who had once walked past without seeing began to look differently. A passerby might carry a bag of groceries for an elderly neighbor. A cab driver might check in when a delivery driver seemed late. A teenager might stop to offer a jacket. The city's attention to the invisible did not cure structural inequities, but it shifted small behaviors. Little acts ripple outward, and Carlos's story had become one of the ripples.
On a regular Tuesday, he would wash a pot and look out the restaurant window. He would sometimes see a delivery rider pause at the crosswalk and look up at the city as if making a small decision. He wondered what would happen if more people took that second to notice. He had been invisible for most of his life, yes, but that invisibility had been interrupted by choice and courage and community. He thought often of his mother's hands cupping dough and of the promises that are kept by actions rather than words. There is a particular kind of dignity in being seen for what you do. For Carlos, visibility was not the end goal. It was an instrument. The medal, the park, the donations, all served a larger pattern, to lift others who might still be overlooked. When people asked what he had learned, he said plainly that the city is made up of people who rarely meet each other in gratitude. We owe one another a little more attention, he would say. We owe one another safety and small courtesies, things that make a life possible. He never forgot the smell of smoke, nor the light that had pooled at the window that night. But memory had softened edges. It had made space for the warm, small things that followed. Hospital visits from neighbors, a care package from a driver he had worked shifts with, the call from his sisters saying that their mother had started telling the story at her church. The household of kindnesses collected into a life that was more than the single night of rescue. It became a lifetime's worth of small gestures. The last public image of him that many remember is simple. Carlos standing at a table in Rosa's place, a circle of delivery riders around him, a pot steaming in the center, a child tugging at his sleeve. There was a photograph of him in work-worn jeans, the Medal of Valor tucked into a drawer, a smile that is mostly private. It is a picture of a man who had been invisible, who chose to be seen in an act that asked very little of him beyond compassion. In the end, the city kept telling the story because it liked the answer the story gave. Invisibility can be repaired by notice. People who serve quietly can be made visible not by being elevated alone, but by the community deciding to look. The mattress that had once been a lifeline became a symbol of how neighbors can make each other whole. So when you walk past a delivery rider cutting across your neighborhood, when you pass by a laundromat or a diner at closing time, consider that there are stories behind every pair of hands. A man once wore a pizza bag and a hood and carried more than food. He carried a future that was small, stubborn, and human. Once that night, he stopped being invisible because he stepped forward. The rest of us had to step with him to keep that visibility alive. If this moved you, please like and share this story, and subscribe for more stories of invisible heroes. Tell someone today that you see them.